Crawford Goldsby was born on February 8, 1876, at Fort Concho in San Angelo, Texas, to Sergeant George and Ellen Goldsby. In 1878, when Crawford was 2, tension flared in San Angelo between black soldiers and local cowboys and hunters. The most significant incident occurred at Morris's Saloon, where a group of cowboys tore the chevrons and stripes off a sergeant's uniform. The sergeant returned to the fort, rallied fellow soldiers, and armed with carbines, they went back to the saloon. A violent gunfight broke out, leaving one hunter dead and 2 others wounded, while 1 soldier was killed and another injured. Texas Ranger Captain G.W. Arrington and his men attempted to arrest George Goldsby at Fort Concho, accusing him of supplying the soldiers with weapons. However, Colonel Benjamin Grierson, the fort commander, contested the Rangers' authority on federal grounds. Realizing the army couldn't protect him outside the fort, George Goldsby went AWOL and fled to the Indian Territory. After George's departure, Ellen Goldsby moved her family to Fort Gibson, Indian Territory, and left young Crawford in the care of Auntie Amanda Foster, an elderly black woman. Foster raised Crawford until he was 7, at which point he was sent to an Indian school in Cherokee, Kansas. He returned to Fort Gibson at age 12, only to find that his mother had remarried. Ellen married William Lynch, a private in the 9th Cavalry, after leaving Fort Apache. Lynch had previously served with the 10th Cavalry, and Ellen remained with the unit as an official laundress, moving with them from Fort Davis, Texas, to Fort Grant and Fort Apache, Arizona. Crawford and his stepfather did not get along, and Crawford began rebelling, drinking, and associating with unsavory people. By age 15, Crawford had moved in with his sister and her husband, Moses Brown, near Nowata, Oklahoma. However, he and Moses clashed, and Crawford soon left. He returned to Fort Gibson, where he lived with a man named Bud Buffington and took on various odd jobs. Crawford Goldsby's life as an outlaw began at the age of 18. It started with a confrontation at a dance in Fort Gibson, where he had a dispute with Jake Lewis, who had an issue with one of Goldsby's brothers. A few days later, Goldsby shot Lewis with a 6-shooter. Believing he had killed him, Goldsby fled Fort Gibson and sought refuge in the Creek and Seminole Nations. There, he met outlaws Jim and Bill Cook, who were mixed-blood Cherokees. In the summer of 1894, the U.S. government purchased a strip of Cherokee land and agreed to pay each citizen a legal claim of $265, roughly $9,357 in today's money. Goldsby and the Cooks brothers, as citizens of the Cherokee Nation, went to Tahlequah, Oklahoma, the Cherokee Nation's capital, to collect their payout. At the time, Goldsby was wanted for the shooting of Lewis, and Jim Cook was wanted on larceny charges. To avoid being spotted by authorities, they stopped at a hotel and restaurant owned by an acquaintance, Effie Krystlynn. They persuaded her to go to Tahlequah and collect the money for them. On her way back, she was followed by Sheriff Ellis Rattling Gord, who was looking to apprehend Goldsby and the Cook brothers. On June 17, 1894, Sheriff Rattling Gord and his posse engaged in a gunfight with Goldsby and the Cook brothers. During the shootout, Deputy Sequoia Houston was killed and Jim Cook was wounded. Although the authorities retreated, when questioned later, Effie Crittenden claimed that Goldsby hadn't been involved in the gunfight. It was someone called Cherokee Bill. From that point on, Goldsby became known as Cherokee Bill, earning a reputation as one of the most dangerous men in the Indian Territory. Following this incident, Goldsby and the Cooks formed the Cook Gang, launching a reign of terror across Oklahoma. Between August and October of 1894, they committed a series of crimes, robbing banks, stagecoaches, and stores, and killing anyone who stood in their way. During this period, Goldsby began losing his hair due to a hereditary disease passed down from his grandfather. As his hair thinned, he eventually decided to shave his head completely, adding to his fearsome persona. Following the murder of Ernest Melton, authorities intensified their efforts to capture Crawford Goldsby and the Cook Gang. As pressure mounted, the gang dispersed. While many members were either caught or killed, Goldsby managed to evade capture. A $1,300 reward was offered for his apprehension, prompting some of his acquaintances to turn on him. On January 31, 1895, Goldsby was captured in Nowata, Oklahoma, by Ike Rogers and Clint Scales. Goldsby was then taken to Fort Smith, Arkansas, to await trial. On April 13, 1895, he was convicted of Melton's murder and sentenced to death. However, his lawyers managed to delay the execution. In June of that year, a pistol was discovered in a bucket at the Fort Smith jail. Goldsby claimed a prison trustee named Ben Howell had smuggled it in before fleeing a few days later. Meanwhile, Goldsby befriended another trustee, Sherman Van, who succeeded in sneaking a Colt revolver into his cell. On July 26, 1895, Goldsby attempted to escape. Armed with the gun, he ambushed the night guards as they came to lock him in his cell, shooting one guard, Lawrence Keaton, in the stomach. As Keaton retreated down the corridor, Goldsby shot him again in the back. Though other guards arrived and prevented Goldsby from escaping, they couldn't immediately enter the jail. Another prisoner, Henry Starr, offered to help. The guards allowed him inside, and he soon returned with Goldsby, who had surrendered and was unarmed. The second trial lasted 3 days and resulted in another guilty verdict. U.S. District Judge Isaac C. Parker sentenced Crawford Goldsby to be hanged on September 10, 1895. However, a stay was granted as the case was appealed to the Supreme Court. On December 2nd, the Supreme Court upheld the decision of the Fort Smith Court, and Judge Parker rescheduled the execution for March 17, 1896. On the morning of his execution, Goldsby awoke at 6 for a smoke and ate a light breakfast sent by his mother from a nearby hotel. At 9:20 a.m., his mother Ellen and Auntie Amanda Foster were allowed to visit him in his cell. Soon after, Father Pius, a Catholic priest with whom Goldsby had been meeting voluntarily for the past 5 days, arrived to offer spiritual support. The hanging was initially scheduled for 11 a.m., but was postponed until 2 p.m. to allow Goldsby's sister, Georgia, to see him one last time. She was expected to arrive at 1 p.m. on the eastbound train. Shortly after 2 p.m., as Goldsby stood on the gallows, he was asked if he had any final words. He reportedly replied, "I came here to die, not to make a speech." 12 minutes later, Crawford Goldsby, one of the most infamous outlaws of the Indian Territory, was dead. His body was placed in a coffin, which was then boxed and taken to the Missouri Pacific Depot. Ellen and Georgia accompanied the body by train to Fort Gibson, Oklahoma, where Goldsby was buried in the Cherokee National Cemetery. Patrick Pendergast was born on April 6, 1868, in Clunamore Townland on the island of Inishbofin off the west coast of Ireland. He was baptized at St. Colman's Church on April 12, 1868. His parents, Ellen King and Patrick Pendergast, were both teachers at the time of their marriage on July 2, 1865. His grandfather, William Pendergast, an army pensioner who lost an arm in Pampeloma, was said to have died insane. Pendergast's mother suffered from frequent bouts of hysteria, while his father died of tuberculosis. At the age of 4, Pendergast sustained a severe head injury from a fall, leaving him unconscious for a significant period. He also experienced prolonged vomiting for 4 weeks after the incident. He was characterized as a peculiar and solitary child, often irritable and excitable, with a poor memory and weak academic performance. On May 20, 1873, at the age of 5, Pendergast arrived in New York with his brother John, age 8, aboard the SS France. By age 16, Pendergast had left home, feeling persecuted by imagined threats, and by age 18, he had developed grandiose delusions of his abilities. He became a fervent supporter of Henry George's single tax movement. In Chicago, Pendergast worked as a newspaper distributor and advocated for safety improvements to the city's railroad grade crossings. By 1893, he became fixated on Carter Harrison's mayoral campaign, believing that if Harrison was re-elected, he would be appointed as corporation counsel. Harrison won the election, securing a non-consecutive 5th term as mayor in April of 1893. Both before and after the election, Pendergast sent numerous letters and made visits to politicians linked to Harrison's campaign, convinced he would receive the position he desired. When the anticipated appointment never came, Patrick Pendergast confronted Mayor Carter Harris at his home on the evening of October 28, 1893. At 7:50 p.m., Pendergast rang the doorbell and was let in by a maid, who went to wake the mayor, napping in the parlor. As Harrison entered the hallway, Pendergast approached and shot him 3 times with a .38 revolver. The first shot struck Harrison in the abdomen, the second pierced his heart under his left arm, and the third hit his left hand at point-blank range. Harrison's coachman, hearing the gunshots, rushed towards the scene with his own pistol and fired 3 shots at the fleeing Pendergast, but missed. Pendergast returned fire without hitting the coachman. Mortally wounded, Harrison died at his home at 8:25 p.m. Pendergast fled down Ashland Avenue but was chased by several citizens and a police officer. He ran to Des Plaines Street police station where he immediately surrendered, still carrying the revolver. During police questioning, Pendergast gave inconsistent reasons for the murder, citing both the failed appointment and Harrison's lack of action on raising the city's railroad crossings. The smell of gunpowder and his empty revolver confirmed his involvement. Due to growing concerns over mob violence, Pendergast was transferred from the Des Plaines Street station to the Central Station downtown. A crowd of 5,000 people quickly gathered outside the station. To avoid unrest, authorities discreetly moved Pendergast to another station on the city's north side, where he was held in the county jail awaiting trial. In his first trial, Patrick Pendergast's attorney sought to have him declared insane. However, Chicago lawyers disagreed, arguing that Pendergast's actions demonstrated rational thinking. He had kept an empty chamber in his revolver, which was a safety measure to prevent accidental discharge, as revolvers of that era could fire if dropped with a live round under the hammer. This precaution indicated clear forethought and rationality, as modern revolvers now have safety features to prevent such accidents. Several doctors testified that although Pendergast was paranoid, he understood the difference between right and wrong and was mentally fit to stand trial. Despite Clarence Darrow later securing a hearing on Pendergast's mental state, the defense failed again in the second trial. Pendergast was found guilty of murder and sentenced to death. At 10 a.m. on July 13, 1894, Cook County Sheriff James H. Gilbert visited Patrick Pendergast's cell to read him the death warrant. At 11 a.m., Pendergast was visited by his brother John, by which time any hope for a last-minute pardon from Governor John Altgeld had vanished. A doctor checked on him at 11:30, and shortly after, a priest visited. During this time, Pendergast insisted that he bore no malice in killing Mayor Harrison. 5 minutes before his scheduled execution at 11:45, his attorney S.S. Gregory arrived for a final handshake and a few brief words. A gallows had been erected in the jail's north corridor, with seating set up between the rows of cells and the high wall. About 500 ticketed witnesses, including the jurors who convicted him, gathered for the execution. To shield other prisoners from the sight, they were removed from nearby cells. At 11:43, Pendergast was led to the gallows, accompanied by Father Gilbert of the Cathedral of the Holy Name, who administered the last rites. Pendergast walked to the trap unassisted, where his hands were bound. Although he had intended to make a final statement, the priest persuaded him otherwise. He quietly told the priest, "I had no malice against anyone." His feet, knees, and chest were strapped, and a white shroud was draped over him. As he stood on the trap, the noose was placed around his neck, followed by a white hood. At 11:48, the signal was given and the trap was released. Pendergast's neck broke from the 6-foot drop, and he showed no movement afterwards. His heart continued to beat for about 10 minutes before stopping entirely. 5 minutes later, his body was taken down and placed in a coffin for burial.